many of you have clothing, shirts or shoes particularly, that display some type of logo. Now, the church setting is a setting where you often don't. Your nicer clothing often don't. That was kind of a passive-aggressive dig. If you did have it on there, that was not my point. But we have brands, we have things that promote. And so if you see a little swoosh, you know it's Nike. If you see a little person on a horse with a stick in their hand, you know it's Ralph Lauren, right? And so you know those types of logos, even though it may not say the name of the company, people know it. They know the company, they know the brand, and they already have a feeling about it before they even see you wearing whatever you're wearing. And so we display these as almost like our banners. And you see these in every aspect of life. The car you drove here today has some type of logo on it to identify the make and model of the car. And not as though you're driving around trying to be a walking advertisement for certain companies. My point is getting at, what does it look like for us to walk around being a walking banner for Jesus? Wearing a t-shirt that says Jesus on it of some sort isn't the full extent of being a witness for Jesus. So my point is not that you go out and get new clothing to tell people that you follow Jesus because of the clothes you wear. If you feel led by the Spirit to do that, by all means, do that. But if that's all we do, then we're not getting the full scope of this. So we're going to look at Exodus chapter 17 here in just a minute about what does it look like for God to be our banner, to be the one that we run to, the one that is displayed from our lives. But I want to come down to a concept I brought up in June, and this concept of the cow and the bison. Some of you may remember this, but when these two animals confront a storm, or when they have a storm that comes at them, they have completely contrasting approaches. Because the cow, when a storm is coming, it will turn and run in the completely opposite direction. Now, we know that no animal can outrun a storm. Even the fastest animals can only run fast for so long. Eventually, the storm will catch up to them. And what really happens is by running the opposite direction of the storm, then the cow endures the storm for a longer time period. So that's what happens with the storm. And now in the context of what we're talking about today, storm could be trial, obstacle, frustration, it could be all sorts of things. But for the sake of the cow and the bison, it's a storm because the bison interacts completely different towards the storm than the cow. Because when a storm comes towards a bison, the bison turns directly into the storm and runs towards the storm with direction and purpose. And so it gets out of the storm much quicker and endures it for much less time. Now, it's not necessarily fun. Both endure the storm, but they endure it with a different approach. So I want to keep that in the back of mind as we look at Exodus chapter 17, but we need to make sure we understand what's happened in Exodus before we get to chapter 17. Because in chapters 7 through 11, we find the 10 plagues of Egypt, where Egypt is devastated because Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go," and we all have a song in our mind or a picture. But and then have the 10 plagues, and eventually, after the 11th plague, Pharaoh says, "Leave and get out of here," and allows them to go. And so in Exodus 12, they escape from Egypt. Exodus 13 and 14, we find the crossing of the Red Sea. The Israelites, all 2 million of them, had left Egypt and were at one side was the Red Sea. The other side was the Egyptian army fastly approaching, and they didn't know what to do. So God parted the Red Sea. They walked across on dry ground and closed the sea up, so the Israelites were now safe. In Exodus 15, they come to the desert, the oasis of Marah, where the water is bitter. God transforms the bitterness, but he calls them to leave bitterness to go to a new oasis. In Exodus 16, God gives manna and quail from heaven, so he feeds them in the desert. Then at the beginning of Exodus 17, God brings water from the rock. There's 2 million people in the desert. They get thirsty awfully quickly, and God is able to provide water for all these people from Moses striking a rock. Then we get to Exodus 17, chapter 17, and starting in verses 8 and 9, where we're going to start here today. It says, the people of Israel were attacked by the warriors of Amalek. So Moses commanded Joshua, choose some men to go out and fight the army of Amalek. Tomorrow I will go stand on top of a nearby hill with the staff of God in my hand. So before we get into what's going on, let's take a history lesson into the people of Amalek. Who are they? So we know the Israelites are the descendants of, we have Abraham, had a son named Isaac, had a son named Jacob. Jacob changed his name to Israel. Israel had 12 sons. We get the tribes of Israel from them, and that's how their people became populated. Amalek is a descendant of Abraham and Isaac and Esau. Jacob and Esau were twin brothers. Esau was the older brother, and so he should have had the birthright. But yet he sold his birthright because he was hungry. He should have had the blessing, but Jacob tripped his dad, with the help of his mom, to get the blessing from his dad, and Esau was kind of left out. Now, the reality is, though, that God chose Jacob. Jacob was God's chosen line to bring his people into this world, to be his lighthouse into a world full of darkness. But Amalek, the person Amalek, was the grandson of Esau. And so he's what, like the first cousin twice removed from Jacob, if you want to follow along with that. But the reality is that there's a family connection here. So, but Esau went this way, Jacob went this way. And so we get to this point in history, and a lot of the Old Testament people are connected somehow with a family relationship. But we see the Amalekites and the Israelites are coming to an impasse in this moment. Now, the Amalekites were a nomadic people. They were a nomadic tribe that raided other people for pleasure and for bounty. They did this because they could. They were bullies. They caused fear with other people, and they also got money and resources from this. So they brought death and destruction. And so there's a phrase at this time that calling someone a friend of Amalek was an insult. It was not something that somebody wanted to be known for. So these are the two people that are going after it. And Amalek attacked Israel. Now, we don't have any details as to why this happened. From just a general reading of the text, it seems as though the Israelites did not provoke the Amalekites in any way. They just happened to do this because this is the Amalekites' MO. This is what they do. This is how they treat people. This is how they go about their business. But just like the Amalekites were a nomadic people, Israel was still a nomadic people. They had just escaped slavery of Egypt for 400 years, and so they're wandering in the desert, and the Amalekites attacked them. So this is chapter 17. Israel still has not received the 10 Commandments. That doesn't happen until Exodus 20. So we're almost there. They still really haven't figured out their system and how they're going to function and what it's going to look like. It's not till the next chapter, of chapter 18, where Moses' father-in-law tells them how to actually be a leader. So they're still really trying to figure all of these things out, and they get attacked by the Amalekites. So Moses comes up with a plan. He goes to Joshua and say, here are the responsibilities. Moses gave Joshua and said, this is what you should do. Get some people together, get some warriors, go attack the Amalekites, and protect our people. Joshua would lead the troops, while Moses would go on top of the nearby hill and with the staff of God. So they had a plan. Hey, Rome, can you help me with something real quick? No, Rome, you don't look at your brother. But no, you can stay. You can stay right there. You can stay right there. You can come up here if you want, but you can stay there. Okay. All right. So if you know this, don't say it, because I'm going to see if Rome will do it for me. Rome, teamwork makes the dream work. Right. That's a common phrase that Rome likes. So what I want to look at here is teamwork makes the dream work. So we have Moses has this plan. Joshua and the army does this. Moses is going to go do this. And then when they work together, we see how God can take care of them and do what needs to be done. But this requires intentionality. It requires that we do things with focus and have clear direction on it. So we'll come back to the cow and the bison. The bison attacks the storm with intentionality. It has a plan. Now, we can easily be swayed by the things of life. The winds, the shapes, the torrents, all these things, the frustrations, even the opportunities. We can be swayed by those things in life. But it's crucial to trust the plan. I say that with a caveat, when the plan is directed by the Holy Spirit. If the plan is directed by human understanding, we don't trust the plan. But if the plan is directed by the Holy Spirit, we have to trust the plan and not be swayed by all sorts of other things. And so we come to Exodus 17, starting verse 10. It says, so Joshua did what Moses commanded and fought the army of Amalek. Meanwhile, Moses, Aaron, and Hur climbed to the top of a nearby hill. As long as Moses held the staff of God in his hand, the Israelites had the advantage. But when he would lower his hands, the Amalekites gained the advantage. Moses' arms soon became so tired that he could no longer hold up his hands. So Aaron and Hur found a stone for him to sit on. And they stood on either side of Moses, holding up his hands, so Moses' hands held steady until sunset. As a result, Joshua and the Israelite army overwhelmed the Amalekites in battle. So that's the plan was now executed. Joshua fought, he led the army in the battle, and Joshua was faithful to the responsibilities that he was given. But when we think of these plans, and in any plans in life, there are risks and there are responsibilities. There are both. Now, Joshua's risk was a pretty clear, cut and dry risk. The risk was death. Joshua and the warriors that he took with him could literally have been killed through this. And it's likely that there were at least a couple that did not survive, right? It's not as though Joshua and the Israelites had no casualties. Now, it doesn't tell us there were casualties, but the reality is there was a real risk involved. He had a responsibility, and in order to fulfill his responsibility, he had to incur risk. And there is risk when God calls us to do something. Our risk may be different than what Joshua encountered. Our risk may be shame, guilt, maybe ridicule, maybe loss of friendship, maybe loss of financial resources or financial opportunity because we won't compromise. We have all sorts of risks that we can incur. And while I don't want to downplay them, I also don't want to say they're the same thing as exactly what Joshua encountered. But to recognize God calls us to a specific purpose, and we need to be faithful to that purpose and not compare it to other person or other plans that God has given. See, Moses' responsibility is that he had to climb the hill. He had to go and position himself to do his part in this plan that they had implemented. Now, on some level, now remember, Moses is over 80 years old at this point, so we can kind of give him a little bit of break. He's not a young guy anymore. But on some level, we may ask ourselves, well, couldn't Moses have done more? Wasn't there more that he could have done? So I think we also have to ask ourselves, how important is prayer? I mean, I think that's a legitimate question we should ask ourselves. If our church has a prayer time, how important is that for us? Or if our church has this program or this ministry, which would we actually give more time to? And I've said this before, but we commonly view prayer as a thing we do before we do the thing we want to do. I'll say that again, maybe a little slower this time. We commonly view prayer as a thing we do before we do the thing we want to do. So, could Moses have done more? No. That was his part of the plan. That was his responsibility to do, because Moses focused on the spiritual side of the battle. Joshua and the army focused on the physical side of the responsibilities, while Moses focused on the spiritual side. He had the staff of God that he was holding in his hands. That as long as his hands were held high, Israel was winning. But when his hands got tired and he lowered them, the Israelites were no longer winning. Now, this isn't about being superstitious. Now, maybe Moses was a little stitious, but he wasn't superstitious. Thank you for that one. But the fact, what I'm trying to get at is it's not as though he was just at the right place, the right time, doing the right thing. Some of you are going to watch a football game this afternoon, and you may do so in a way that might be a little superstitious. You may have the same socks on, or the same jersey, or same shirt. Maybe you eat the same food. Maybe there's a food you don't eat at that particular time. I don't know. And while there's nothing wrong with having those traditions, because just because something's a tradition doesn't mean you're really actually superstitious about it. It's more of a comfort thing for you. What Moses was doing is not as though it's a superstitious thing. It was being faithful to what God has called him to do. He was standing in the gap for the Israelites. Now, Joshua was standing in the gap in a much different way, but Moses was spiritually standing in the gap for the Israelites. He was carrying the spiritual burden for Israel, but his strength was limited. He could only do so much. And the point is not to say to equate Moses with the pastor. That's not what this is necessarily about. But to recognize that one person can only endure standing in the gap for so much. Right? So we need to stand in the gap for each other. It's not about relying on certain people to stand in the gap. We need to stand in the gap for each other, to lift each other up in prayer, recognizing that our strength is limited. And Moses' strength was specifically limited in a way that he couldn't do it himself. And we know none of us can do all this by ourselves. None of us is able to be Jesus and do everything. We are limited. The spiritual battle is too big and too long and too burdensome for one person to carry. But again, this is about how we come together as a community. Now, Moses was the leader, but it's not about me as the pastor. It's about how we can carry these spiritual burdens for each other. How can we support each other? Because no one needs to be an island. No one needs to be isolated and be by themselves. No one needs to be so isolated from others that they don't feel they have anybody else that's for them. Which is where Aaron and Hur come in. They come in and they help Moses. He couldn't carry the burden by himself, but with Aaron and Hur, we again see that teamwork makes the dream work. That these come together to help him. But if we picture a moment, this may not have been a super fun situation for Aaron and Hur to be in. If you're holding somebody's arm up, you know where your nose often is? Right in this area. And it was not a 5-minute thing where they could just hold their breath. There may have been some unpleasant aroma that they had to endure for the length of the time where they were helping Moses. So sometimes we have things that aren't super desirable that God calls us to do. But in all reality, when I think about this moment, the movie Lord of the Rings comes to mind for me. Right? The Return of the King. You remember when Frodo has the ring at the mountain and it's just really, really close, but he has no strength to get up the mountain, and Samwise Gamgee comes up and he says, I can't carry the ring, but I can carry you. And so he carries Frodo up the hill, and the ring gets destroyed. But if you haven't seen the movie or read the books, they're like 80 years old, so I can't spoil it for you now. But so that's what happened. See, Moses was the one who was called to hold the staff of God. Aaron and Hur weren't called to hold the staff, but they could help Moses. See, it's not about taking somebody else's responsibility, but being faithful to the responsibility that God has entrusted you. See, Joshua and the Israelites overwhelmed Amalek. It was a complete victory. There were no details given except for the fact that God's people won, that God gave them victory. But joining God in victory requires sacrifice. It required Joshua and the army risk battle. It required Moses stand there in the hot sun all day holding his hands up. It required Aaron and Hur be more or less a footnote in the story of they held up his hands. It required that they lowered themselves and trusted the plan that God has given them. So the question I ask is, what sacrifices are you making? How are you actually sacrificing for God? Because being here is great. Being here is awesome. But if that's the extent of your sacrifice, are you really sacrificing for Jesus? Or are you just taking a bit of your time to be here, just to be present? See, this is about being faithful. It's important for us to be faithful. And faithfulness is greater than strategy. If you forget your math symbols, that's a greater than sign. Faithfulness is greater than strategy. Because no amount of strategy, resources, money, people, insight, ability, or talent can take the place of faithfulness. Faithfulness is far greater and far more important for us. Because the Israelites did not defeat the Amalekites because Joshua was a master of military strategy, because Israel had better technology, because the Israelite soldiers were better, or because they wanted to win more. Israelites won because Moses stood in the gap, because Joshua was faithful, because Aaron and Hur supported Moses, and because the soldiers fought. Because each person was faithful to the task that God had given them. But see, the story doesn't end there. Because in verse 14, it says, after the victory, the Lord instructed Moses, write this down on a scroll as a permanent reminder and tell it to Joshua. I will erase the memory of the Amalekites from under heaven. Moses built an altar there and named it Yahweh Nisai, which means the Lord is my banner. He said, they have raised their fist against the Lord's throne, so now the Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. God instructed Moses to build a reminder. Something that would remind Moses of what God had done for his people. I wonder what reminders you have in your life. Do you have reminders in your life of how God has been faithful? Of how God has brought you through a time where you didn't know how you could overcome it? Of how God has provided for you in ways where things just didn't make sense? What reminders do you have of how God has proven faithful? Because we need them. We need them to remind us in difficult times. We need them to remind us when we just don't know what to do. See, this altar was called Yahweh Nisai, which means the Lord is my banner. The Lord is the one I support. The Lord is the one I proudly display. The Lord is the one I follow and want in my life. The banner means that we represent God. It means that we belong to Him. I wonder how people identify you as belonging to Jesus. Do they actually identify you as belonging to Jesus? Or do they see you as just another person who says they go to church and that's really about it? Well, I like the things about Jesus, but I haven't really given my life to Him. I like the things about Jesus, but He hasn't changed my life. He hasn't done anything for me, or I haven't given myself to Him. Do you represent God in a way that actually honors God? Or do you represent God in a way that is self-serving because you want to get things out of it? See, this is God's battle, and verse 16 shows us how God is going to deal with our enemies. Right? It says they have raised their fences against the Lord's throne, and so now the Lord will be at war with Amalek from generation to generation. This is God's battle. He invites us to participate with Him in the victory that He has already secured. But it's His battle. But sometimes we get this vendetta mentality of God needs to make this right, or God needs to do this. Well, our role is not to tell God what to do. Our role is to trust that God will make things right. That God, who is the God of justice, will take care of things. Because part of teamwork makes the dream work is that I got to trust God knows what He's doing. And I've got to trust that God has my best intention in mind. That God is going to take care of me. But God taking care of me isn't about worldly measurements. Well, God, why did this person get the raise and I didn't get the raise? That's not necessarily about God taking care of us. That's about us measuring things according to the ways of the world, not according to the ways of God. Because there's a lot at stake here. And one of the biggest things at stake is that if we don't get this right, there are thousands of people in our community who don't know Jesus. And if we fight the wrong battle, we're going to miss the opportunities to impact them for Jesus. We're going to be like the cow who is drifting in the storm, who is suffering and wavering and has no sense of direction if we fight the wrong battles. But if we stay focused on the mission that God has given us, we'll endure the trials or difficulties less, at least according to the bison. But we'll also stay focused on the mission that God has given us, which is the goal. See, the goal is not to lessen the amount of trials we have. That's great if our trials are less. Nobody complains if we endure less suffering. But the goal of following God is not to endure less suffering. It's to be faithful to the mission that He has given us. But when we think about what we do as a church, it may be wise, it probably is wise for us to ask ourselves, are we sustaining a church or are we converting a community? When I say community, I mean the outside. Is what we do all about how we take care of us in here? Or are we like missionaries going out to how can we impact this community, these communities for Jesus? Because if all we're doing is sustaining in here, that's not inspiring. Nobody from the outside is really going to want to be a part of that. It's not what Jesus calls us to do, and eventually we're going to die. That's the life cycle. That's what it is. And if we polled every one of you here, you would all say, well, yeah, we don't want to just focus on ourselves, but yet we're always tempted to do that. We're always tempted to drift and allow those things to come into our lives. But we have a battle that we're fighting, but our battle is not against a tangible enemy like the Amalekites. The Israelites had this tangible enemy that was in front of them. Ours isn't the same type of battle, but yet we serve the same God. That's one thing we always have to keep in the back of our mind. We serve the same God. Now, it's unwise for us to pretend storms don't exist or difficulties don't exist. But it's also unwise for us to say the wrong opportunities don't exist. Because there are wrong opportunities that will present themselves all the time for us to chase this or this. And it may look really good. We may think it's what God wants to do, but we got to stay focused on God, not necessarily the opportunity. Now, God can change courses for us. He can say, you should go after this opportunity. He can do those things. This is why we have to trust the plan only if it's given by the Holy Spirit. If the plan is by us people, then it's not something that we can trust. Now, we don't have to be paranoid. I just want to be clear on that. We trust that God will give us direction and guidance, that God will make it clear to us when we're faithful to Him, when we take serious the responsibilities that He has bestowed upon us. But how are we working together to complete the mission that God has given us? If we're in isolation, it's really easy to be swayed by the storm, by the difficulties, by the new opportunities. Now, that being said, just because the herd is going one way doesn't mean it's the right way. Right? With the cows, they're all probably going the same direction, but that doesn't mean it's the right or good direction. It's about being focused and faithful on what God has put right in front of us, on the direction of go this way. And sometimes we can see a long ways in the distance. Other times we can't even see the next step, but He says go this way. And so we take this step blindly, not knowing where it's leading. But what does it look like for us to confront this head on? What does it look like for us to focus on being faithful with the role that God has given each of us, even if it means we have to put our nose in somebody's stinky armpit? Even if it's undesirable, what does it look like for us to be faithful with what God has given us? And what does it look like for us to support each other as the body of Christ? As people who are pursuing Jesus together. as people who trust each other, as people say, this is the mission that Jesus has given us. And so we say, teamwork makes the dream work. What does that look like for us? What does that look like for us as a church to come together? To say, this is the mission, these are the responsibilities. I'm going to be faithful with the responsibility that Jesus has given me. But I'm also going to trust that you are going to be responsible to the responsibility that Jesus has given you. That we're going to trust each other. I'm going to do my part, and you're going to do your part. What does that look like? And I think one of the ways that we can really garner trust with this is to spend more and more and more and more time with Jesus. The more time with Jesus we spend together, the more we're going to trust each other.